All right, and we are live for Monday evening. May the 4th be with you. So we are live now for Monday, May 4th for this evening's live stream, Dare to Know. So I think the thing is that as intentional agents, we begin our lives steeped in the worldview of others, right? We begin our lives steeped in the worldview of parents, of formal and informal educators, of society at large. And those three levels, the levels of orientation, we can think of as being the familial, the community, and the society levels. And those three levels of society that we deal with are sort of what we begin with. But if we want to embrace our abilities as decision makers, we need to evolve beyond that sort of institutionalized thinking that we inevitably grow up with. What do I mean when I say institutionalized thinking? I mean that we are raised within an institution, within systems, and our worldviews are inherently and implicitly informed by those views that we grow up with. So if we want to continue our discussion from last week and the week before and some of these topics that we've been talking about now, really I've been talking about for years, and be able to really embrace that Musashi idea of having an immovable mind, we have to undertake this process of daring to know, of transcending that immaturity that Kant would call it of our thinking and transition into thinking for ourselves. So we can start by thinking about this in sort of a structuralist way. And the language I want to use is the language of Jean Piaget and Robert Kegan. And where we are trying to get is this divide between the imperial and the institutional self. And the institutional and interdivisional self is sort of those transitions that we are making. So at the institutional level of self, that is where we see ourselves as embedded within the broader society. Perhaps one of the best examples that Kegan offers is this idea that the institutional self is sort of your typical older adolescent, sort of that tail end of high school individual and entering college individual who has learned and understood how to have interpersonal relationships. She has learned how to balance sort of that incorporative self where at the infancy stage everything is just pure ego, and as we move forward we become humans in participating in society. And at what Kegan calls this stage 5 transition, we begin to escape from that institutional self into the domain of what he calls an inter-individual self, where we as an individual agent relate to other individual agents, but we don't necessarily we're not unwilling to be critical of the institutions that we've come from. So if we think about that sort of perspective, most of the time when we are growing and developing, we become immersed in those systems of orientation, those worldviews that we grow up with. And yeah, we rebel against them in some ways, but ultimately as we are sort of exiting adolescence and entering young adulthood, for many people, the norm is to become very embedded in those institutional systems that we were raised with. We begin to just see them as obvious, and that is how things are intended to be because that's how they are. That sort of harkens back to the conversation we had before about sort of this ought-is debate that we can pull from Hume, and the idea that we can't just say how things ought to be because of how they are. So what we're looking to do then is sort of get beyond this very structuralist view that happens to us early in our intellectual and cognitive development and push into now this stage 5, this inter-individualist pattern where, again, we are no longer fixed in our thinking. We have adopted some fluidity in our relationship with the systems and structures that surround us, and we begin to take on this new viewpoint. This viewpoint is often labeled post-structuralist. Post-structuralist and postmodernism is something that I've talked about in Boyd Book Club lectures and something that I've spent quite a bit of time on. But very briefly, modernism is the period in which human beings have a very rational and concrete worldview that says that we can know. It is filled with epistemic certainty. It is filled with predictability. One of the single most defining sort of characteristics or aspects of that time period would be Newtonian mechanics, right? Newton gives us this very predictable, rational, empirical worldview that says this is how the world is. And then we get quantum mechanics. And with quantum mechanics, we find out that there's this thing called wave-particle duality. And the nitty-gritty of wave-particle duality is that a subatomic particle, a photon, a electron, an atom, molecules now we find up to fairly large sizes, behave as particles. They travel in a straight line right up until the point that you allow them to travel in a way that they behave as a wave and you observe them. And now, while they are not being observed by technology, they will exhibit very particle-like behaviors. The second you begin watching them, they begin acting like waves. We can't explain this. That sort of idea would be fundamentally incoherent to Newton. It would wreck his very concrete, predictable, modernist worldview. And that's why we can say to some extent that quantum mechanics is a sort of postmodernist science. It says that it's not so simple as that. Reality is not so simple as we've been led to believe. It's not implicitly predictable. And when it comes to thinking about that idea cognitively, intellectually, I think that Boyd gives us a lot to work with, right? We can talk about the OODA loop model as being a very post-structuralist model. And yet, it's structuralist in its own way. So let's blow this up. Let's take a little bit of a look at it, right? So we've talked about the OODA loop before, and we'll really quickly go through it again, right? As a reminder, this is not a linear cyclic system, right? The tendency is for us to read the feed-forward loops and to look from left to right, go observe, orient, decide, act, unfold the interaction with the environment, we loop back, boom, and we keep going through this. We've talked about this before. The loop is not that simple. For those of you who aren't as familiar with Boyd's work, I really do encourage you to watch the Boyd Book Club videos. Semester 1 of Boyd Book Club has been, I'm releasing it publicly now every week. So those videos are going up on, I believe, Thursday every week. I think there's 11 videos in the first semester. So that's, it's probably 5.5 hours worth of content that just starts to dig into Boyd, his ideas, where they come from, and understanding them in the light of the sort of the intellectual zeitgeist of his time. So thinking about the OODA loop then as both a modernist structural system, right? It has a structure. We could call this an institutional structure. It also, though, has its mechanisms for recursive thinking and self-critical analysis that allows it to examine critically what's going on within itself, right? So our observations feed forward to our orientation. We've talked about this before. Our orientation both acts as a very explicit thinking and decision-making process where it continues on through those feed-forward loops. However, it also has this implicit guidance and control that comes off of the top. There are also the feedback loops from both decision and action that allow us to sort of simulate and wargame how different things will occur. We can ask ourselves, what would I do in this situation and how might it unfold? And through those acts of simulation, we are actually able to engage in a recursive thinking process that allows us to critically examine our own orientation, the worldview that we hold towards these various ideas, structures, types of things that are going on. So, if we take this structural system and combined it with a critical post-structuralist, postmodernist worldview, we actually get into something that has started to be called metamodernism. Metamodernism as a modern philosophical concept is right now mostly being explored and discussed in the realm of architecture, art, design, things like that. What might be a good example of a meta-modernist artwork that we could all get access to? I think it would be the Childish Gambino music video for This Is America, right? So this video gained a lot of traction when it was released in 2018 and incensed a lot of people. But at the end of the day, I think it's a brilliant piece of art because it does two really interesting things. It juxtaposes a very uplifting, energetic, almost mythical view of life with this very concrete reality rooted in experience and violence. It is placing those two things side by side. If we were to say that the mythic dimension is the modernist dimension and the sort of deconstruction of that through the lens of a criticism of race, policing, and all the other things that occur in that video are the postmodernist critique, the occurrence of both of them at the same time, aware of one another, is sort of the meta-modernist approach. I think what's interesting about that, when we think about it in terms of epistemology, when we think about it in terms of an ontological process that can kind of undergirder and form a foundation for our thinking as independent agents who are trying to transcend a wholly institutional worldview that's sort of been placed upon us and now are able to look at that critically and reflectively, is that we now are able to engage in sort of this process of accepting the structuralism that came into our lives in the form of the worldview that we received from those family members, those community institutions, that society that we're steeped in, but also engage in a critical examination of it, a critical deconstruction of it, so that we can pull out the best parts of it and move forward with them, right? So metamodernism is sort of, in my mind, it is Musashi advocating the ideas in the Book of Five Rings about knowing your tools, knowing all of the ways, not having preferences, and not just taking it on authority because you have grown up in a particular school of martial art, because you have been exposed to a particular set of worldviews from Buddhism or Confucianism or whatever else, not just because your Lord says it so, but because you have gone out and investigated. It is not that the ideas that come from those various structures and institutions are implicitly wrong. It's that they cannot be complete. So, as any model of thinking, as any conceptual scheme would be, they fall into that realm that, again, George Box tells us, all models are wrong, some of them are just useful. all models have utility. All models can provide a useful mechanism for understanding the world around us if we know how to decode them, when to be critical of them, where they apply, where they don't apply. This has been a really interesting conceptual framework for me to spend the last week or so really reframing in my mind. I'd gone back and been rewatching some of the Boyd Book Club videos from first and second semester and re-looking at some things, reading some articles recently, and sort of engaged with this process and found that this new meta-modernist perspective that I'm taking, I think, has a lot of value. And that's something that I'm going to be exploring in a lot of detail here. So for those of you who are on Patreon already, you know that I announced that I will be doing Boyd Book Club Semester 3. That's going to launch the first week in June. So patrons get access to the Boyd Book Club videos as soon as they are released. So I'm working on Semester 3 right now. The syllabus for that is going to drop on May 18th via Patreon, and then that semester, the first video will go live on June 4th. And that's going to be 7, I think, pretty deep and intense weeks of really considering this concept of how to wrap our minds around daring to know and merging the structuralist and post-structuralist worldviews into sort of this meta-modernist worldview that I was talking about earlier. I'm really looking forward to where this is going to go. So again, for those of you who are interested, the easiest way to get access to that right away is to jump in and join Patreon, patreon.com/ChrisFSW. You get access to that as soon as those start dropping. Through the rest of May and June, I'm going to be releasing the Semester 1 videos publicly. So those videos were shot, published, and created last summer for patrons, and that information is now going live. Semester 2 is uploaded and fully available for anybody who joins through Patreon. You'll have access to those right away now before Semester 3 comes out. Otherwise, Semester 2 will likely go live and be public in probably early fall, and then Semester 3 will go live in January of next year. So that's sort of the way I cycle these. I create them for patrons, and then eventually they are released to the YouTube audience as a whole. So continue watching those Semester 1 videos as they drop on YouTube each week, and then hopefully you'll join in with us with Semester 2 and 3. So those are going live pretty quickly here. So with that said, I appreciate you all taking a little bit of time out of your evening and joining in with me tonight. I want to thank the patrons who make this possible, particularly Kevin Richson, Travis, Andrew Kehoe, Eddie Crombie, Chase Morgan, Adam Mayers, Ryan Trader, Justin Ide, James Brennan, John Kwan, Sonny O'Connor, David Hinosa, Eric Chisholm, Brock Clapp, Zach Riddle, Brandon Douglas, Timothy Bullard, Trevor Harderhorst. So thank you all patrons at all levels for the support that you've shown. If you check out the Patreon page, you'll see that there are some other new features that just dropped today, some new perks that are in there as well. So hopefully you'll join in and continue doing this. I will see you next Monday for another live stream. Have a great week. Cheers.